Hello, my name is Daryl Robert June, and I'm going to start out this program of Dollars and Cents by explaining the June jobs report that just came out in the United States. The jobs report was heralded as real positive. Stocks went up in the United States. Everybody feels real good about it. People feel that this is going to allow the Fed to dial back on its purchases of Fed liquidity because the job market is so good. I don't know who these people are talking to. Well, I do know. They're talking to themselves. The Fed's job report in June was positive by around 164,000 jobs. They said it grew 164,000 jobs. And so it did. But I want to tell you how they arrived at that conclusion. There was positive job growth on the plus side of approximately 360, whatever it was, between 304,000 jobs were added. Okay? Were added. Oh, job growth. 300 to 400,000 jobs are added. All right? Well, how did they... Well, it is true, strictly speaking. But how did they arrive at this number? Because the net number was approximately 164,000 jobs were created. Well, to arrive at that net number, they had to subtract the amount of jobs lost. Well, all of the jobs that were added were part-time jobs. The 300,000 to 400,000 jobs that were added were part-time jobs. And to come to the net 164,000 positive, jobs added, they had to subtract the 264,000 jobs that were lost. Well, all the jobs that were lost were full-time jobs. So you had approximately 250,000 full-time jobs lost, approximately 300,000 to 400,000 part-time jobs added, and it came out a net over 160,000 jobs added. Well, isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful? So the stock market went up. They are lying to you folks. And no one's looking because everybody's scared, and I understand it. But what I want to talk about today generally is an explanation of how we got here because it involves China. And China didn't do anything to us. The United States, we did it to ourselves. But I'm not talking about we, meaning you and I, that we did it to ourselves. I'm talking about them, the ones who run this country, the ones who determine what happens, and the ones who pass the laws and make everybody do what we're supposed to do. Because they are definitely in control. All right? But it does involve China because that's where the jobs went. I want to explain to you how that first happened. How they got America's jobs. I went to China for the first time in 1976, far before most people went over there. When I was in China, most of the Chinese were riding around on bicycles. Very, very few cars. They all wore blue, Chairman Mao's blue coats, blue pants, all right? And I would say 95% of the people, 98% of the people are on bicycles. And the only cars that were there when I was there in the mid-1970s were Russian limousines for the very powerful in the Communist Party and East European cars. All right? Now that has all changed. Well, how did that happen? How did China ascent go up, and how did America basically become a country of part-time workers working for minimum wage and the 1% owning everything? How did that happen? Well, I want to show you something here. All right? There are two graphs here. The first graph that you see on the top is a graph measuring Chinese GDP growth. All right? The GDP growth from essentially 1952 to 2005. All right? It goes along, and then in the mid-1980s, especially 90s, it starts skyrocketing. China was flat. How did that happen? Well, it basically happened when Deng Xiaoping went over and he took Chairman Mao's socialist-based crap-ass culture, economy that doesn't work, and said, we're going to allow free market to come in. We're going to allow people to go out and, own things. And the Chinese love owning things, most of which they love is real estate. But essentially, they allowed the Chinese entrepreneurial spirit out of the gate and it exploded upwards. That's chart number 1. Okay? Chart number 2 that you see at the bottom is another chart. What's that chart? Well, chart number 2 is the Dow Jones. Okay? The Dow Jones Industrial Average. All right? It started exploding in the 1980s too. All right? 1982, Ronald Reagan was president. The Dow was at 777. All right? By year 2000, the Dow was at, what, 11,000. 1,600% increase in 18 years. The greatest expansion in the history of capitalism. All right? So you see the Dow Jones exploding upwards at essentially the same time that the Chinese GDP also grew. Well, there was one reason for both. And that reason is this other chart here. What you see, this chart is from 1990 to 2000. Basically, it's a chart of the growth of the U.S. money supply. Right. In 1987, Ronald Reagan kicked out, he got rid of their central banker, Paul Volcker, who was a tight money guy, who basically took over when Jimmy Carter was president. We had an explosion of inflation, not because of Jimmy Carter, because we went off the gold standard. We cut gold from the U.S. monetary supply, so it started growing. And Volcker had to come in and raise the interest rates over to 22%. He did it 22%, rang inflation out of the system, all right? And so what you had was, basically the U.S. economy went back to normal again after Volcker came in. But the money boys that Reagan brought in, the money boys, what was it, William Casey, head of the CIA? Well, Casey was a Wall Street banker. This was the first time you had a Wall Street banker being head of the CIA. Showed where power and money was at in America. Wall Street, CIA, same thing. And truly, my friends, it really is. As we've certainly found out in this administration in the last 2. Wall Street and the CIA, NSA, they're 2 heads of the same monster. Okay? But it first started under Ronald Reagan. All right? So what you had here, I want to show you again, is the graph of the money supply rising, explosively rising. And not only did that happen, but essentially you had giving rise to both Wall Street, expansion on the bottom with the Dow Jones, and the China's GDP. Why? Because basically, the consumer boom that gave rise to China's explosive growth, because China basically became the sweatshop that manufactured all the goods for America initially, was driven by credit-based demand out of the West. So credit-based demand, based upon central bank Federal Reserve policies, cheap money policies, not only made the Dow Jones explode upwards, because it was all a bubble. It's all a bubble. It also gave rise to China's great expansion, economic expansion, because China became the manufacturing in Asia that manufactured all the goods that American consumers were buying on credit. Voila! Dow Jones goes up. China goes up. All right? China just followed Japan. The previous years, Japan exploded upwards. Why? Because Japan made the electronics, the cars, the cameras that Americans were buying in the 1980s and early 1990s. All right? After that, the Japanese economy went just like the United States economy. They went on loaning money. Their banks basically are the largest creditors in the world. Japanese banks, not American banks, Japanese banks. Took over from America in terms of aggregate debt volumes in the 1990s. All right? But the jobs didn't leave until the late 1990s from America. Why? Because Wall Street got together, they bought Bill Clinton and the Democratic Party via Goldman Sachs, all right? And they shoved through the World WTO agreement allowing China into the WTO. All right? Now, I want to tell you something about China and Japan. It's real interesting why the United States gets mad at one country and not another. Because people don't understand it. All you do is you read the headlines and you get mad. Oh, they're doing this, they're doing that, they're doing this. Why do you get mad? Because they're trying to make you mad at somebody. All right? They don't want you to get mad at their allies. They want you to get mad at their enemies. There was a very curious thing happened with Sarajevo. Remember Sarajevo? Yugoslavia? Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslav republic, all right? It was run by a dictator named Tito. All right? He was communist. Tito ran modern Yugoslavia. And basically, modern Yugoslavia was like Ireland, in the sense that you had two religions that hated each other. I mean, really hated each other with a blood hatred. You had the Protestants and the Catholics in Ireland that hated each other. They were blowing each other up. They were shooting each other. I mean, they were kidnapping each other. It was what happens when you get religion going and you foster competition between the two religions. That's how England rose to power, divide and conquer. And as Booker Fuller said, not only do you divide and conquer, you keep dividing and keep conquered. All right? That's how England ran the world for approximately 250 years. Well, Tito did basically what he did. He rose to power in Yugoslavia and kept the peace by what? By holding a gun to the heads of the minorities in Yugoslavia. Who were they? Who were these minorities? Well, there were the Croatians, the Croats, all right? And there were the Serbs, okay? Now, the Serbs were basically Russian Orthodox, all right? Catholics. And who were the Croatians? Well, they're also the same racial stock as the Serbs, except the Muslims, the Turks had come over, invaded them, and the ones who ended up under Turkish rule became Muslims. All right? Same people. Same people. Same racial stock. The difference between the Serbs and the Croatians were the Croatians was what left over after the Turks went back to Turkey. And because they'd been in Yugoslavia, what became Yugoslavia for a long time, and they imposed their religion on them, the ones who were left behind were Muslims. The only difference between them and the Catholics was they'd been conquered by the Turks and forcibly converted. Well, after the Turks were kicked out, the Croats were left there, and they were still Muslims. Except now they were hated, and they hated the Serbs. The same people, the same racial stock, hated each other. Why? Because one worshipped as Russian Orthodox, and the other ones worshipped God as Muslims. Same God with different names, same people, and they hated each other. And the reason how Tito kept control is he had a gun to the heads of both. All right? Head to the gun to the head of the Serbs, gun to the head of the Croatians, and you had peace in Yugoslavia until Tito died and the Croats and the Serbs went at each other's throats and they had a civil war. All right? So this is what happened over there. Well, what happened in China was that the Chinese came in and all of a sudden the United States shoved the jobs over to China. Why? Why didn't the Japanese do the same thing? Because the reason is that when Japan came to power in the 1980s, the United States was paranoid of Japanese power. Why? Because the Japanese had Sony, the Japanese had Nissan, the Japanese had all their companies. And the American multinationals were paranoid of Japanese corporate power. So they didn't do anything. They didn't send U.S. jobs over to Japan during the 1980s, and they could have. The Japanese had cheap labor. The Japanese had technology. But America's multinational corporations kept U.S. jobs in the United States because they didn't want the Japanese corporations to get even more power. Well, when China started producing goods, There weren't any Chinese corporations. There weren't any Chinese versions of Nissan, Toyota, Sony, Hitachi, Panasonic. The Chinese didn't have multinational corporations that could challenge U.S. corporations. The Chinese had a cheap labor pool. And so what happened is, in the 1990s, when Bill Clinton was president, and the Democratic Party had been taken over by Goldman Sachs and Wall Street. The Democrats were never Wall Street boys. The Wall Street boys were always Republicans. White bread. Of course they were Republicans. They represented power in America. But the way to get real power is to buy off your enemies. And that's what Goldman Sachs did. The Democrats were so bereft of power because by 1990s that when Goldman Sachs came in and offered Bill Clinton through Robert Rubin money, they sold out lock, stock, and barrel. By the end of the 1990s, Wall Street formed a coup and took over the Democratic Party and shipped all the jobs over to China. Why? Because China did not have corporations like Japan did. They had cheap labor. In the 1980s, Japan was a threat to America. It was a threat to America because they had corporate economic power base. All right? China didn't have that. China offered cheap labor to U.S. multinational corporations. All right? And in the 1980s, American labor were all paranoid about the Japanese. Ah, Japanese, 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 Japanese. I remember something that happened during the 1980s, early 1980s. Some Chinese guy was in Detroit. And these auto workers, these redneck blue-collar auto workers who had been whipped into a frenzy about Japan, looked at him and said, "He's taking our jobs. He's one of those goddamn Japs taking our jobs." And they killed him. It wasn't Japanese. It was Chinese. But he passed for an Asian, and they killed him. Because the American public had been whipped up into an anti-Japanese fervor by corporations who were threatened by Japanese corporations. 10 years later, they could have been the only threat that China had to America was in terms of labor. And U.S. corporations shipped Chinese U.S. jobs wholesale over to China, compliments of Republicans and Democrats. And when America woke up 5 years later, their jobs were gone. Lock, stock, and barrel. Lock, stock, and barrel. All those things manufactured in the United States were shipped over with factories, Chinese making them out. Why? Because Chinese factory workers were making $2 a day. American factory workers were making $15, $16, $20, $25, $30 a day because of the union movement. You know, in America, the word union has become a dirty name. Reason why America lost its competitiveness? Unions. Unions ruined America because they lost, because American corporations couldn't be competitive. Because U.S. workers wouldn't work for a goddamn $1.50 an hour like Chinese workers would. Chinese work for $1.50 a day, $2 a day. And those damn labor unions kept holding out for benefits, 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 benefits. Well, who benefited when they shipped U.S. jobs over to China? Not labor. The shareholders. And who are the shareholders? The America's rich, the wealthy. And now they're even richer than ever. And America's workers, they're poorer than ever. And everybody's worried about China. Ah, China is going to become the next world power. And they're going to do to us what we did to them 50 years ago. Americans forgot what they did to China. You know, because they tell themselves all these wonderful things about our country, how we helped everybody. You know, when America got its act together and decided to go rape the world if it could, of course, England was already doing it. So when America ended up in China in the 19th century, they were late to the table. England was already over there. Germany was already over there. France was already over there. The Netherlands was already over there. And the United States wanted in on the deal. You know, it's like coming upon a woman being raped, and you're going, hey, come on, man, give me a chance. America called this the open door policy of China. Let me at China too. Don't hog her for yourselves. We want an open door. Doesn't open door sound wonderful? Oh, open door sounds like freedom. Open door sounds like liberty. Open door sounds like equality. What open door meant was, don't hog China's carcass for yourselves. Let me have a chance at that carcass. That's what America's open door policy was. And America wonders why the rest of the world doesn't look at America the way Americans do. Well, there's a reason. They weren't lied to like Americans were lied to. They saw what America was doing. All this crap. You know, there's a word called karma. It became very popular with the hippies. Karma. Karma meant that if you did good, good would come back to you. And if you did bad, bad would come back to you. All right? That's a Hindu concept of karma. And the hippies got into it. It sort of rung a bell in the hippie subculture. Karma. When things happen, they go, oh, it's your karma. You know, like somehow you were somehow responsible for what happened to you. Karma. All right? America doesn't believe in karma. America believes in power. Power overrides karma. Power meant you could do whatever you wanted to the rest of the world and get away with it as long as you had enough power. Revelations happened recently about the British colonial rule. I remember growing up in the 50s and reading Life magazine, seeing things about the Mau Maus. Oh, Mau Maus! Those African tribes that were committing horrible things to white settlers. Mau Mau, uprising. Ah, those black natives, the horrible things they were doing. Well, when push came to shove, all of a sudden it was found out that the British had been doing this to the African natives. Not only the British, the Belgium had chopped off their arms. King Leopold chopped off the right arms of all the Africans that refused to work for the Belgium companies. Cut off their arms. All right? So these revelations came out. And in the revelations, there was a statement by one of the British had made about it, about making these files secret. And they decided the world shouldn't know about what the West had done in its colonies. And I remember one of the statements from one of the British overseers. And he said, well, if we must sin, we must do so quietly. In other words, if we're going to torture, if we're going to pillage, if we're going to rape, if we're going to shoot those who tried to defend themselves against our imperialistic extraction of their wealth, then we must do so quietly. We wanted to look good while we were doing it. There's such a thing as karma. I'm an old hippie. I believe in karma. I believe what goes around comes around. And I believe what's coming around, unless we change, and we haven't yet, is going to make the past look like the good old days.